So I won't talk about who's online. Just remember, if you're online, to send the words before 9 a.m. Ellis is here. Kesterson is here in red. Remember, everyone deployed is what red stands for. Harrison is here in red. Let's see. Speciation. There we go. All right, it's 8. Get started. First, we'll do reminders and stuff like that. So, again, today I'm not going to have office hours, but that doesn't mean I can't meet with you. It just means I can't meet with you when I normally can. I will not be online or in my office for office hours. But if you need to meet me or want to meet me, send me an email. We'll find a time to meet. Speaking of which, your labs are due today. So, if you want, please spend like 5 minutes. Meet me online. Let me look it over, and I can verbally tell you, like, you might want to fix that one. You might want to fix that one. You know what I mean? Like, let me tell you what's wrong before you submit it. That'll save me a bunch of time and you a bunch of time too if you'd like to correct your mistakes. But it's a lot easier for me to grade a paper or a lab or anything that's perfect. You know, I love giving good grades. One, because that means you're doing well, and two, because it makes things quicker and easier for me. So yes, if you want to find a time to meet me sometime today, please let me know so I can look over your lab or independent work or whatever it is that you might be submitting today. I probably won't be working over the weekend. It's Marine Corps birthday weekend. It's Veterans Day weekend. You know, Veterans Day is on Monday. So, but that doesn't mean I'm opposed to it. It doesn't hurt to ask. Speaking of which, Veterans Day, so Monday again, we will not be meeting in person on Monday, but I will be online. And again, plan B, if something goes wrong, if you log in and I'm not there, I don't know, give me like 5 minutes, I guess. If I'm not there by 8:05, just do your own thing, and I will post a video from the previous semester that you can watch. And again, I doubt that'll happen, because now that we have a plan B, nothing's going to go wrong. But whenever I don't have a plan B, something goes wrong. I think that's it for the reminders. Also make sure you do the exam. I know some of you have already done it, but make sure you do the exam before Sunday. I think that's it for announcements and reminders. Yeah, does anybody have any questions or announcements on your end? Do you guys have anything you want to announce? Okay, so let's jump back into this PowerPoint. I want to remind you, excuse me, that this it's the same material that comes from your textbook, but I'm just teaching it in a different way because I took it from the old textbook, and therefore it's in slightly different order. For example, right now when we're talking about the diversity of life in your textbook, that's chapter 12. So according to your textbook, we're going from chapter 12 to chapter 11. Not a big deal, but I just wanted you to know, just in case you happen to be one of those very good students who likes to read the textbook a lot. If you're reading the textbook, like, hey, we're way out of order. It's on purpose. And speaking of it being on purpose, I did that on purpose because the old textbook, in my opinion, does a better job of presenting this information. Speaking of which, this part right here, what we're about to do is explain the diversity of life. If you remember when we talked about Mendel, and a little bit when we talked about DNA structure, the old textbook kind of gave it as a story. Like, hey, here's what we used to know, and then here's what we found out, and then here's what we found out after that. So we're about to do the same thing. So when I do this bullet point explaining the diversity of life, it will be, sort of like storytelling. Anyway, the first word for attendance is united, as in the United States of America. Or united we stand and divided we fall. Question?
Do I need to email you that I came in like 2 minutes late?
It would hurt. Otherwise, I might forget. Otherwise, you'd just be absent for one day and lose your 2 points of extra credit. But it's up to you. Or maybe I'll remember. Anyway, let's talk about this. Explaining the diversity of life. So we talked about the diversity of life a little bit. We talked about classification and how you have to know things going from domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I need to have that memorized. Now we're going to talk about how we got to know what we know. And the explanation of the origin of the diversity of life is the evolutionary theory that was proposed by Charles Darwin. I'm almost definitely not going to ask you that because honestly, it's too much of an easy question. You probably heard his name your whole life. You can hear it a lot in this chapter, but yes, Charles Darwin who first proposed the theory of evolution that we use today. And you'll see as we go through this portion of the chapter, there were other theories, some of which they were like close to being correct, but some of which were not. But they didn't really nail it down until Charles Darwin proposed what he proposed. And we'll get to that. He proposed it in a book called On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection that was published in 1859. I'm not going to ask you that. You're going to learn a lot about the stuff that was in his book, but I'm not going to ask you the name of the book or when it was published or anything like that. I will say for independent work for one point, and again, don't do this now because I'd rather you pay attention to the lecture, but you can look it up later. He also wrote other books. So what other books did he write? Like, look it up. Send me an email. According to this source, these are the other books he wrote. And again, if you want to, you can make a paper out of it and just like summarize. This book was about blah, 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 like in one sentence, right? So if you were to talk about this one, you could write, he wrote a book called On the Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This book was about natural selection. Anyway, he was not the first to try to explain the origins of diversity of life. That's what we're about to talk about. We're going to go through this quickly because as far as the exam is concerned, it's not very important. I'm not going to ask you questions, but I like how the old textbook kind of, again, gives the story of what we used to know and what we've come to know. So here we go. Before we knew what we know now, there was this idea of fixed species. So for example, Aristotle, and your book also mentions Plato, the new textbook, not the old one. Both of them suggested that species are fixed permanent forms and they do not change over time, right? So these Greeks, they looked at the world and just saw everything and said, this is the way it is. This is the way it always has been. This is the way it always will be, right? Things don't change. A human is a human and will always look like this. And a cat is a cat, will always look like that, right? They are fixed permanent forms. And again, I'm not going to ask you that, but I want to give you the story of coming to know what we know. The Judeo-Christian culture also reinforces this idea. If you take the Bible literally, that tells us that things were made, right, and haven't changed, right? And again, you can click this picture. It will actually take you to a link where you can watch a little video that It talks about his ideas or their ideas of fixed species, and you can also click that. The Holy Bible icon, and it also takes you to a little video that talks about their idea of the origins of life and the origins of the diversity of life. Let me read my notes here. Click Aristotle's bust for a short biography. Oh yeah, so it's just a short biography about Aristotle if you click that picture. Click the Bible for a short video on biblical interpretation. Yeah, so exactly what I was saying. So you can look into that if you want to. This is a 100 level biology course for non-freshmen or non-biology majors. So we don't have time to talk about every proposed thing, right? But I'm going to at least mention it. There it is, other people have proposed other things. And we're now skipping past this and moving towards 1600. Well, you'll see where we're moving towards too. But if there's anything I didn't mention on here and you want to look it up, you can for independent work. Like what are some other ideas about the origins of life? Anyway, in the 1600s, religious scholars estimated that the Earth was about 6,000 years old. So religious scholars, mind you. So using their religious texts and things like, historical things, they estimated the world was 6,000 years old. The idea that all living species came into being relatively recently and are unchanging dominated for centuries, right? So starting from the 1600s, well, actually for centuries, even before that, that was the idea. That was the dominating idea. It was like everything was started about 6,000 years ago. It started the way it is. Things are still the way that they were back then, and they will not change, right? It's dominated for centuries. But even though that was the dominating idea, naturalists at the same time were grappling with interpretations of fossils. And we're going to have a whole section about fossils when we talk about the evidence of natural selection and evolution. But for now, you need to know what a fossil is, and it's the imprint or remains of organisms that lived in the past. So make sure you know that. Especially this part. I think everybody knows the remains, right? When you see like a big T-Rex skeleton, like that's the fossils that we think of, I think. But it also includes imprints and some other things that you're going to learn about later. But yeah, so imagine that back in the 1600s, or you're looking, you think the world is only 6,000 years old. Think everything that was ever created is still here and it's still the way it always has been and will not change. Yet you're looking into these fossils, like, what in the world is this thing? Because nothing has ever changed. So why am I looking at this creature when I don't ever see it? Like, what's going on with this? Here's a good example. These snake stones, for example, right? They thought they were coiled bodies of snakes, but they were curious. Like, why is it that every time we find one of these fossils, there's never a head, right? All the times they find these fossils, and they kept thinking they were snakes, they were wondering what happened to the head. Then eventually they started thinking, all right, what if things have changed, right? What if things weren't made the way they were and then never changed? They started to question that. And they thought, what happened? What if some of these weird fossils that we're finding of animals that clearly we don't see anywhere, what if some of them had gone extinct? What if they've just disappeared from the earth, right? So they're starting to come along scientifically with these thoughts. Then there was discoveries in the 1800s, including this fossil of a gigantic sea creature called the ichthyosaur, which means fish lizard. And this was a big find because this convinced many scientists that extinctions had indeed occurred, which was a big deal at the time. Really quickly, let me back up. I put an X through this big old thing because I'm not going to ask you about snake stones. These are just examples. Same thing here with the ichthyosaur. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. The point is, again, fossils were confusing to them because like, hey, the world's 6,000 years old. Nothing has ever changed. And they start finding these fossils. Like, well, obviously things must have changed. No one's ever seen this creature. Then again, I'm sure some people must have been like, of course, we haven't seen this creature because we haven't been all around the world. Still to this day, we could find a creature. We're still finding new species all the time. But nonetheless, they started coming along and started thinking, okay, well, at least there may have been some extinctions, right? So in the 1800s, that's where the scientific consensus was. At least they were starting to say, yeah, sure, maybe some things have gone extinct. All right, so let's talk about some bigger ideas, some newer ideas. So again, naturalists were comparing fossils, right, these things of dead animals, with living species, and they also noted patterns of similarities and differences. So they weren't just, say, oh yeah, that's interesting. They were looking at them and studying them and comparing them to things that were alive. Clearly, they were different. They were not the same species. They were unlike anything they'd ever seen living, but there were some similarities. So then in the early 1800s, there was a French naturalist named Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck who suggested that the best explanation for these observations is that life evolves. So we put an X to this first bullet point. Let me underline this, his last name, because that might be a test question. Because that was pretty groundbreaking. Lamarck was the first person to suggest evolution has occurred. Right? Before Lamarck, no one, at least publicly or even no one's recognized for it, but says that evolution might be the reason for this. So definitely know Lamarck. You probably don't hear about Lamarck as much as you hear about Charles Darwin because he didn't quite get the mechanism right. So he was right suggesting that life evolves because we see it evolving today. Now you might not believe that that was the origins of life, and that's fine. I'm not trying to tell you what to believe, but we see life evolving in our lifetime, so we know evolution happens. But anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck in the upcoming slides. The next word for attendance is marine, like a marine biologist. Marine. All right, so let's talk about Lamarck. He explained / proposed that evolution is a refinement of traits that equip organisms to perform successfully in their environment. That was a pretty good explanation. That was a pretty good proposal. That was pretty much correct. But then his next portion of it was the part where he got it wrong. He thought that by using or not using certain body parts, an individual may develop certain traits that passes on to his offspring. So for example, if for some reason, I don't know, humans were all right-handed and we just never used our left hand for anything, right? We're just scrolling around with our fingers with the right hand and all instruments were like trumpets instead of like saxophones, you know. For whatever reasons, humans just never used their left hand. According to his theory, eventually the left hand would just disappear, right? Meanwhile, giraffes, and that was a hypothetical thing that I made up. Meanwhile, like another example, this is real. He thought, for example, that giraffes, because they were constantly stretching their neck to reach those leaves, which was true, that is what they were doing, and they did have an advantage because they had long necks. He thought because they were stretching them their whole life, that when they had offspring, that their offspring would have necks a little bit longer because they were using them, and that's where he went wrong.
Is that not what happens to giraffes?
Not at all, no. Glad you asked,
Why do they
no.
have necks?
We'll find out. Actually, you know what? I'm not sure if it's on here, so I'll go ahead and tell you, even though we're just kind of skipping ahead. It's because, you know, everybody, you know, like look at us in this classroom, right? We're all a little bit tall, a little bit short, longer necks, shorter necks. Same thing with giraffes. Of course, we just think of them as long necks. But back in the day, they had varying lengths of necks. And the ones that happen to have longer necks could reach more food. And they were more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce, more likely to be able to feed. You know, the mother was more likely to be able to provide milk. Yeah, so the ones with the longer necks had more offspring, and therefore, over generations, they got longer and longer. And then, of course, you don't want it to get too long, right? Long is good, but eventually too long, your body can't handle it. There's a whole other slew of problems that come along with a long neck. So it probably, I guess, I don't know this. This is worth looking up for independent work. I would assume giraffe necks are not getting any longer. They probably hit the optimal height. But I don't know that. Great question. Anyway, I'm not going to ask you about giraffes. But yes, so again, according to Lamarck, and that's a great example, he thought because giraffes used their neck, that their offspring would come out with longer necks. Sort of like, I don't know, if I was still working on jets and I spent all my days reaching up to fix the bottom of a jet, you know, then maybe when I had kids, they would come out a little bit taller with a little bit longer arms because I spent all my days doing this. Anyway, his idea of how species evolve was mistaken, right? So, yeah, that was just an example. So please don't think this example I just gave you is a correct thing. It's not. That's not how giraffes evolved. That hypothetical thing I talked about is not how people would evolve. But his proposal that species evolve as a result of interactions between organisms and their environment that was true, and that did help set the stage for Darwin. So he was very close, right? Like she said, like she's like asking about the giraffes, like wasn't it the giraffes trying to reach their food? And it was. It's just it wasn't because they were stretching it. It wasn't some sort of physiological thing. It was just that the giraffes with the long necks survived and passed along those long neck genes. Any questions about that slide? All right, that finally brings us to the man himself, Charles Darwin. Here we go. There's a bunch of stuff you don't need to know on here, but I included it anyway. For example, he was born in 1809 on the same day as Abraham Lincoln. I'm not going to ask you that, but it's kind of interesting. He was fascinated with nature as a boy. That's not a test question, but that is relevant because that's going to explain his thinking and how he came to be who he is. He was in medical school at first, but he quit it because he found medicine boring, and also he found surgery horrifying. And you have to imagine, surgery was probably very horrifying back then. Think about they didn't they didn't have anesthesia and things like that, so it probably was. So then, when he left medical school, this is what I love about this story, he studied to be a clergyman at Cambridge. So it's not like, unfortunately, a lot of times natural selection and religion usually butt heads. But it's interesting to me because it isn't as if he didn't know religion, right? He studied to be a clergyman. But then at 22 years old, he began a voyage on the HMS Beagle, which is that thing down there, that helped frame his theory of evolution. So as far as the exam is concerned, this whole slide is useless. But again, it's helping you tell the story, helping you understand his background so you can understand how he came to know what he knows. Let me see. If you download this PowerPoint and click the picture of that, the Beagle there, the HMS Beagle, that's a little picture, or excuse me, it'll bring you a little video. Yeah, anyway, so you can look at that if you want. It's more about his journey. So as far as the exam is concerned, it's not really useful information, but it is interesting. But I'm not going to ask you specifically about his journey. Some parts of it are more important than the others, and we'll talk about that. All right, so let's talk about his journey. The Beagle was a survey ship charting South American coast. Actually, it charted a lot of stuff. But the part that we're interested in for this story is what it was doing in the South American coast. Not that I'm going to ask you that. So again, Darwin went around the world, including South America, which is what we're focused on now. It's not like they were on the boat the whole time, right? They got off, they stopped, they got off. And when he got on shore, he spent his time exploring. He spent his time collecting fossils and also living plants and animals. He kept detailed journals of his observations. And he noted characteristics of plants and animals that made them well suited, to diverse environments. I have a little star there. Let me remind myself what this is. Your book specifically describes his observations of ground finches. Oh, yeah. So, yes, he did a lot of observations. The one your textbook gives an example of is these ground finches. And he noted that they were different, right? And we'll talk about that later. Not that I'm going to test you on it, but this is a great example, and I use this example on Wednesday of adaptive radiation, right? So, or speciation. Excuse me. Talk about speciation, where they have radiated out, right? So you have one species, that radiated out and then found itself in different environments. And over time, even though it was the same species, they started looking different. And he was really focusing, again, on these finches. And you can see they have all these different beaks. That's because they have different things to eat. And therefore, there's different advantages to having a smaller, longer bill or a big, thick bill, like the crushed seeds or whatever it may be. Now, again, your book goes into detail about all that, but those are just examples. So when you're studying that, don't think I'm going to ask you questions about the finches or any other examples. It's just a great example to show how natural selection changes species. Any questions so far?
Yesterday, the beginning, that first word is a genus.
Yeah, genus, no species. Yes. Yep. So that should be in italics, but this is from your textbook. I don't know why they didn't put it in italics. Yeah. So genus, species, genus, species, genus, species, genus, species. Very good. And again, those were likely at the beginning one species, but then as they went to different environments, that changed them. Because, again, they were looking at or eating different things is the best example for this one, whether it be nuts or nectar or insects or something like that. Therefore, having a different beak shape would be advantageous. Therefore, over generations, the birds where there's a lot of nuts would evolve beaks for nuts. Meanwhile, the birds that were in a place that didn't have a lot of nuts but had a lot of flowers and nectar, they would evolve a beak for that because they could eat better. Therefore, they could survive. Therefore, they could pass along their genes. Good question. But again, just to put a big old X to this, just to remind you, it's just an example. I'm not going to ask you about the finches. And if I do, it won't be like to memorize something. It'll just be using the finches as an example in the question itself. So there's nothing to memorize about the finches. Here's a picture of his journey. Like I said, he went all around the world. But where we're focused on is what he did in South America, specifically in the Galapagos Islands. And you'll see why when we get there. It's actually not random, but it's actually pretty important, the stuff that he did here and where it's located and how many, the fact that there's islands, and you'll see when we get there. But anyway, yeah, that was his journey. Not that I'm going to ask you anything about that. I find it interesting because Darwin, Australia is up here. So I don't know why he went to the southern parts of Australia, but Darwin, Australia is on the north coast. Also random information, but there you go. Again, we're going to focus more on what he did in the Galapagos Islands. And you can see, so that's 40 kilometers, 40 miles. That's almost perfect. So my hand is about 40 miles. So you can see like that island is almost 40 miles long. These two islands are really close to each other. They're all very close to each other, right? That's very important. You'll see why later. Actually, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about it now. Yeah, I'm talking about it now just in case it's not on the PowerPoint. No, it is on the PowerPoint. It is. Let's move forward. And if it's not, I'll talk about it after the fact. So here we go. Let's talk about his observations. Again, we're talking about Darwin's journey here. His observations indicated that geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationships among organisms than similarity of environment. You do need to know that bullet point. And let me explain what that bullet point means. He was saying if things are closer, the closer they are together geographically, the more similar they are, rather than if they're far apart but have similar environments. Sort of like that adaptive radiation. So, for example, if you found something in the desert of South America, it would look more like something in a close by, forest of South America, as opposed to desert of South America compared to the desert of Australia. Of course, you never went on Australia, but those are just examples, right? The point is, the closer things are, the more similar they are. At least that was what he observed. And then the example from the textbook is plants and animals living in temperate regions of South America more closely resemble species living in tropical regions of the same that continent than species living in similar temperate regions of Europe. Meaning again, he hasn't gotten there yet. But the point is, you started with one species and it started traveling out, going to different places. And as it encountered different environments, that changed it in different ways. But it started from that original species. Therefore, there was these similarities. Unlike something that had started on a whole other continent. Now, of course, those were just his observations. What I just said right now is not 100% true, because the continents used to all be together a few times, right? So they're still moving. So there were times when, you might look at something on one continent and look at it on the other, and they're really closely related. Like, well, how did that happen? And that's because probably at one time they were together. But again, the continents have separated. And of course, some, like I said, they're still moving. But anyway, those are just examples. But know that first bullet point. Geographic proximity is a better predictor than similarity of environment. I'll even underline that for you. Geographic proximity is a better predictor than similarity of environment. So let's dig into that a little bit more. The South American fossils he found, though clearly examples of species that had gone extinct, or they were different from living ones, they were still distinctly South American in resemblance. Right? So they resembled living things. Like, for example, does anybody know, if you had to guess, what that is? Okay.
Alpaca.
Yeah, I'm thinking either an alpaca or a llama. I don't even know the difference. I mean, I know they're different, but I can't tell by looking. How about that?
Toucan.
Yeah, toucan. That's what I thought too. Anybody know that one? Looks to me like a capybara. Anyway, the point is, those are all artist depictions of fossils. So those are all animals that have gone extinct. But to his point, he's looking. Of course, they didn't look like that, but because he found those fossils. But he's looking at these fossils, and they're different, but very similar to things that are alive. You're kind of going back to that stuff we were talking about earlier. So again, these are all his observations. Like, he's looking at all these things that it's getting his wheels turning. He's like, why is this? Why is it that all these extinct animals on this continent look so much like the ones that are alive, but they're still clearly different? So that leads us to this. Darwin was intrigued by the distribution of organisms on the Galapagos Islands. And this is what I was getting at earlier. This is important here. The Galapagos Islands are relatively young volcanic islands about 540 miles off the Pacific coast. So here's South America, here's the Galapagos Islands. That one bullet point has some very important information. Relatively young, right? So that means the South America was there way before the Galapagos Islands, meaning there was plants and animals, and everything else living on South America, who obviously weren't living on those islands yet because they didn't exist. Then, because of volcanoes, they showed up relatively not that long ago. And the distance is also very important too, 540 miles. That is so far away that usually plants and animals and other things can't make it from South America to that island. So you have to imagine when those islands first showed up, there was probably no life on it, very little life. And then over a long time, again, it was far enough away from South America that stuff wasn't just easily coming over, right? The plants and animals were not going back and forth on a regular basis. But it's close enough where it was possible. So it did happen occasionally. The point being, using those finches as an example, you may have had like a handful of finches eventually made it over to the Galapagos Islands, maybe because there was some storm that blew them away. Who knows how they got there? The point is, they did make it, and then they were kind of stuck there, right? Because them getting there was like a freak accident. So they probably couldn't make it back to South America. And probably more finches were not coming back in from South America because it's so far away, right? So again, close enough where they could make it by a freak accident, but far enough away where they weren't just traveling back and forth. So because of that, and again, just using the finches as an example, those finches were now living in different environments than where they came from, right? So then the finches that had whatever about them, let's focus on beak. The finches that had the beak that allowed them to eat more on those islands, those are the ones that survived and reproduced, that passed along those genes. Meanwhile, the ones that had beaks that didn't work for where they're at, they died off. So they didn't reproduce. So those genes did pass along. So that's why the proximity is very important, and the fact that it's relatively young. This is how we had this speciation occur. We had all these South American plants and animals eventually sometimes make their way to the Galapagos Islands, and they were essentially stuck there. Meaning they were isolated and they're in their own little environment that was different than mainland South America. So because of that, even to this day on the Galapagos Islands, there's most animals that are found there can't be found anywhere else on Earth. But again, they do resemble mainland South American species, because that's where they originated from. So this is a great example of what we talked about last week with, Wednesday, when we talked about isopatric speciation, which again is when they're separated geographically. So that's what happened. Again, they're geographically separated. They're living in two different environments, so they evolved different ways. Any questions about this slide? We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but I'm going to make sure you don't have any questions about this slide. All right, so again, as important as this is, I'm not going to ask you how far away it was. I'm not going to ask you if it's relatively young. I just want you to think about that and you to know that, because again, this explains the isopatric speciation that occurred. So a couple of examples that I'm also probably not going to ask you about. He noticed that the Galapagos marine iguanas had flattened tails that aided in swimming, and that they were similar to but distinct from the land-dwelling iguanas on the South American mainland. So that was just one example, right? You can tell, like, this obviously looks a lot like the iguanas that he saw on the mainland, but they're different. These things are adapted to live underwater. They have other adaptations too. They don't just have flattened tails. They also like squirt salt water out of their eyes when they get too salty. Do you have a question or are you just stretching? Okay. So anyway, he also noticed that each island had its own distinct variety of giant tortoise, which is interesting. Think about this too, going back to what I was talking about with isopatric speciation. These iguanas, when you talk about all the islands, all the Galapagos Islands, they all have the same species of iguana, which makes sense because they're aquatic iguanas. They're marine iguanas. They swim from island to island. They're not all living in their own individual little environment because they're moving around. The tortoises, on the other hand, cannot go from island to island, and the islands are different, right? So those tortoises who are stuck on their islands were geographically isolated, that isopatric speciation. So because of that, now each island has its own distinct tortoise. Because again, they're not going from island to island. They're not mixing their genes. They're not living in the same environment as the rest of them, right? Each one on its own individual island has its own individual environment that it's living in. But again, those are just examples. I'm not going to ask you questions about that. So are there any questions about that slide? All right. Small little known fact here. Actually, you guys might be too young. Do you know who Steve Irwin is? That crocodile hunter? Anyway, he used to own one of Darwin's turtles. So Darwin took one of these turtles back with him to England and kept it as a pet. And then when he died, actually, I don't know how Steve Irwin got it, but eventually Steve Irwin got it because those tortoises lived to be very, very old. Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little video about marine iguanas. You can also watch this little video about the Galapagos tortoise. Here's a good example. This particular species of tortoise has a dome shell, and this one here has a saddleback shell. And people who are familiar with the area can tell you, oh yeah, it's a saddleback shell. It must have been from this island. They all have their distinct looks. And again, it's because of the island that they came from. Let's see. The next word for attendance, I'm not even going to say it this time, I'm going to write it. You know what? I did that out of order. That's okay. That's okay. Core. Core is the next word for attendance. And then I'm going to have a third or a fourth. I'm sure you can guess what it is, but it should have been the same. But I kind of quit coffee. I don't know if you guys can tell. Last week I quit coffee and I'm just not up and at it like I usually am. So those were his observations. So let's talk about his new insights. All that stuff he observed. Let's talk about his new insights that he came to that. Actually, there was one more observation. This actually should have been in the other portion. But while he was on his voyage, he was strongly influenced by a book called Principles of Geology that was written by a guy named Charles Lyell. And if you click his name, download the PowerPoint, click his name, there's a little video you can watch about him, pretty short. This book suggested that Earth was ancient. So remember, at this time, everyone's like, yeah, Earth is 6,000 years old. Some people still believe that. But he's proposing, no, it's much older than that. Earth has been sculpted over millions of years by gradual geologic processes that still continue today. Of course, that is now the scientific consensus. And that is important because, again, think about it. These are all the things that's influencing him, that he's witnessing and observing, that's leading him up to the natural selection, which we haven't talked about officially yet in this story, right? We're talking about how he got there, how he got to know what he knows. He also, on this journey, witnessed the power of natural forces to change Earth's surface. He experienced an earthquake that raised the coastline a meter. So, meters is what, 3 feet? So, probably around there. You saw, we had meter sticks in the first lab we did, where I held one and then held the other and measured how tall you were. One of those is a meter. So he was able to see in one earthquake that the earth changed by that much, right? He saw the rocks come up by 3 feet in one earthquake. So then he thought, all right, obviously things could change a lot over millions of years. So, because of all this, he began to doubt that Earth and its organisms had been created only a few thousand years earlier. So, this is starting to seed the doubt, where you start to think, no, I don't think the Earth is 6,000 years old. I don't think the things living on Earth are 6,000 years old because of all these observations. So then he finally got back to England. He reflected on his observations. He analyzed his specimen collection. He discussed his work with other scientists. And then after all that, and this wasn't right away, by the way, and you can look this up for independent work if you want. How long was it between when he got back to England until he wrote that book where he proposed natural selection? Because it wasn't right away. Like I said, first he did all this stuff. Then eventually, he concluded that present-day species are descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in some ways. So again, like in that case, we're talking about comparing living things with their fossil things. These are clearly related, but also clearly different. And over time, differences gradually accumulate by a process he called descent with modification. He also proposed a mechanism for how life evolves, and he called it natural selection. In the first definition I'm going to give you, though I'm never going to ask you the definition of natural selection, because you'll see. I'm going to ask you questions more like the mechanisms of natural selection. This is still just an introduction, but anyway, the first definition I'm going to give you is individuals with certain inherited traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than individuals with other traits. And again, that's a good independent work topic. Once again, question me, question the textbook, question the PowerPoint. Look it up, right? And you could say, according to my textbook, this is the definition of natural selection. According to this source, this is the definition of natural selection. And then in your own words, just talk about how those definitions are similar or different. Or maybe they're exactly the same, just worded a little bit different. Those are the kind of things you can talk about in your natural selection paper. Or again, just for one point, I'm giving you this definition. For one point, you can just email me and say, according to this source, this is the definition of natural selection. But again, I hear a lot of clicking. I'm not, you guys do what you want. I don't see what's on your screens, but I would prefer you to pay attention to the lecture and do your work later, but whatever works for you. Anyway, we're still talking about what he was doing when he got back to England. He hypothesized that as descendants of remote ancestors spread into various habitats over millions and millions of years, that natural selection resulted in the diverse modifications or evolutionary adaptations that fit them to the specific ways of life in their environment. This is everything we've been talking about, right? But this is finally we get to it, put it in writing. So he's saying there was this ancestral species that just migrated out of its origin, and as it went to different places, it had different environments, and therefore the ones that were in that environment were fit for that environment. And the ones that went to a different environment eventually became fit for that environment. Again, like the iguanas, right? The iguanas that were on the South American mainland were fit to climb in trees. They were not fit. Excuse me. Good grief. Adapted. They were adapted to live in the trees, right? But then the ones off the island were adapted to live in the water. That's just one example. Any questions about that slide? Okay, let's really dig into his theory then here. I kind of gave you the answer to this question that I asked you earlier, but that's not very specific. But anyway, he spent about 2 decades compiling and writing about his evidence for evolution. Meanwhile, there's this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, who I'm probably not going to ask you about on the exam, but he's definitely worth mentioning. He was also a British naturalist. He was doing his field work in Indonesia and conceived basically the same hypothesis that Darwin did. Back then they weren't talking to each other on Facebook or anything, so they didn't know this was happening. They didn't know that each one of them was doing this individually. But yeah, he came to basically the same conclusions, which is interesting because, look at Indonesia. I mean, it's not the same thing we're looking at with the Galapagos Islands, but it is similar in that, it's far away enough, it's pretty far away from mainland Asia and mainland Australia, but also close enough where things can happen, things could migrate occasionally. Also, I don't want to get too deep into this, but there used to be more of a land bridge in that area because back when there was the Ice Age, water was sucked up by the ice, So the water levels on Earth were very low, and there was actually a land bridge there. So imagine that. Imagine this being one body of land, and then after the Ice Age disappeared, it starts to flood. Now all of a sudden, all these little islands are all these little environments that have plants and animals on them that used to be on the same mainland. But now they're tiny little islands, right? So again, isopatric speciation. These organisms used to be living on the same area, right? And then when the water rose, they're now in individual areas with unique environments. Anyway, if you download the PowerPoint, you can click on his name and watch a little video about him too. Any questions about that slide?
I got a question.
Yeah.
I can understand an animal moving from one island to another island, something like that, or a bird can fly over the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
But how can a plant get from one area over to another area?
Wind and water, well, and animals. So animals would carry seeds on them, especially birds. Like for example, that's why peppers are hot for mammals. You know, and the reason peppers are hot is so mammals don't eat them. Of course, humans are weird; we like hot stuff. But birds can't taste heat, so birds will eat the peppers. Doesn't bother them. They eat a lot. They fly somewhere else. They poop out the seeds, and then the seeds have been spread. Coconuts float, for example, so they'll float easily. And mangrove seeds will float. Yeah, all kinds of ways. Those little spurs. I don't know if you've ever been to the beach and how those things like attach to you. Attached to you or your clothes on your feet. Those are seeds. So yeah, they hatch all kinds of rights. Or dandelions, when you blow them, they blow in the wind. There's all kinds of ways. Seed dispersal is the answer. A great question. And also keep in mind, like I said, this used to be, not completely, but larger. There was a land bridge here because when the water levels were really low, if I remember correctly, I don't remember for sure, but I'm almost positive, you can completely get from Asia to Australia. I think. Either way, even if that's not correct, the point is there was a lot more land there, right? Because the water had been sucked away for ice. And because of that, seeds spread there the same way they do in West Virginia. They just, easy spread because there's no water in between them. It wasn't until the glaciers melted and the icebergs melted that the water level rose and created those islands. Those weren't always islands. Great question. So, on the origins of species by means of natural selection, Darwin made two proposals. The first one was existing species descended from ancestral species, which we said earlier. And then the second one was natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. And of course, later in this chapter, you're going to learn there are other mechanisms of evolution, but that is the big one. Right? So make sure you know his two proposals. Existing species descended from ancestral species, and natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. And of course, again, even if you don't believe that, even if you believe things were created the ways that they are, we see them now, we still see natural selection in action. So even if that's not where we came from, you don't believe that, you still have to recognize the fact that it's still happening. Natural selection happens, we see it in action. Anyway, any questions about that side? Okay, so the idea of evolution generated predictions that have been tested and verified by over 150 years of research. So that was the theory. And because of that one theory, we have had a lot of hypotheses, and these hypotheses have verified that theory. So consequently, scientists regard evolution by means of natural selection as a theory. Remember, we talked about this in chapter 1. Theory is different than a hypothesis. A theory is a widely accepted explanatory idea that is broader in scope than a hypothesis. It can generate new hypotheses and is supported by a large body of evidence. So please remember that. Whenever anyone says evolution is just a theory, remember theory in scientific terms is a big deal. Right? Theory isn't a hunch or a hypothesis or an educated guess. Theory is like, we've pretty much proven this. We keep doing things that provide evidence to support it. Anyway, any questions about that slide?
Hypothesis makes the theory?
A bunch of hypotheses do. Well, you know what? I take that back. The better way to say it is the theory makes the hypothesis.
Yeah, that sounds better.
Yeah, because we can knowing the theory of natural selection, I could today sit down and come up with a bunch of hypotheses that I wish I could test. Like, you know, and I could probably, if I have the time, would love to come up with some examples of how humans are changing, you know, because of natural selection. Because of the theory of natural selection, I could come up with some hypotheses of how humans will change in the next 1,000 years. But again, natural selection is a type of evolution. So let's talk about the theory of evolution. Theory of evolution states that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different than present day ones. That picture down there, again, I don't make these memes, I just find them. I should put a big L on there or a line through it, because even though that's a wrong meme, whoever created that meme doesn't know how evolution works. But I put an L for Lamarck, because according to Lamarck, you know, that's what it would happen. People don't do duck face and selfies anymore, do they? That's probably an outdated meme. Now you guys do the fish mouth or whatever, sucking in your cheeks. But anyway, that's the theory of evolution. And again, there's hardly, if any, questions where I ask for definitions. And you'll see why. We still haven't even gotten to the real important stuff as far as the exam is concerned. Because as far as the exam is concerned, we're going to ask about like the mechanisms of evolution, the mechanisms of natural selection, the results of natural selection, the different types of evolution. We haven't even gotten there yet. Let's see, we only have 2 minutes left. I'm not even going to do a last word for attendance, but when we get back on, when we meet online on Monday, we will talk about the evidence of evolution. You guys have a good weekend. Again, I'm not going to have office hours, but please email me if you want to find a time to meet. Like, if you need to meet me, I'll make it happen. I'll try my best to make it happen.
All that clicking is me taking notes.